Welcome back to Crimson Tide Today. I'm Zack Aitken, and I appreciate you joining me for another conversation about Alabama football. If you're enjoying the channel and you want to help it continue to grow, make sure you leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share the video with an Alabama football fan. And don't forget to head down to the comments section either. I always enjoy hearing your opinions and discussing the biggest topics with you guys surrounding the Crimson Tide. For additional Alabama coverage and recruiting news and reactions throughout the week, be sure to follow me on X and Instagram at ZAitken7. So there's a lot to get into today, so let's settle in and let's start the opening drive. So we got a really good question from listener Jake about Alabama's quarterback competition. And Jake, he asked, what would you say is the most recent comparison to this quarterback battle? Would it be, like Blake Barnett versus Jalen Hurts or Jalen Hurts versus Tua Tagovailoa? And for me, I think you actually have to go back a little bit further. And that's why I really love this question, because I'm an Alabama football history nerd, but it's wild to me that my answer to this question is now being treated like history a little bit. Because the comparison I keep coming back to is 2011, and that was A.J. McCarron versus Phillip Sims. And the more I think about it, the more similarities I see. Going into that 2011 season, Alabama had to replace Greg McElroy, and neither McCarron or Sims had ever started a college football game before. But McCarron, he was clearly the more experienced option. He had been in Alabama's football program longer, and he had served as the primary backup in 2010 and appeared in 13 games over his first couple of seasons and had actually thrown some passes in meaningful college football games. Alabama's own 2011 preseason media guide, they described McCarron as the more experienced quarterback that was competing for this job. But then you also had Phillip Sims. Sims was the younger, highly recruited quarterback that had a ton of upside. He had been one of the top quarterback prospects in the 2010 recruiting class, and he redshirted his first year at Alabama and entered the 2011 season as a redshirt freshman who was ready to compete for the starting job. So basically, you had the older quarterback who had waited his turn and knew the system, who was competing against the younger, highly touted quarterback who everybody was excited about in Tuscaloosa. And that's why I think 2011 is a better comparison than some of the other Alabama quarterback battles that we've seen. I've seen the Mac Jones and Bryce Young comparison, and I understand it because Mac, he was the older guy who had been in the program, and Bryce was the five-star, hotshot quarterback that was coming in, and everybody was excited about him. But I think the major difference here, other than Bryce being a true freshman in 2020, was Mac, he had already started meaningful football games for Alabama the year before. When Tua Tagovailoa went down in 2019, Mac took over and he started 4 games that season, including the Iron Bowl versus Auburn and the Citrus Bowl against Michigan. And in that 2019 season, he finished with just over 1,500 yards passing and had 14 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. So when Alabama got to 2020, Mac, he wasn't completely unproven. We already seen him run this offense before, and I think that's why this comparison doesn't fit quite as well. That 2011 comparison was a lot different than 2020 because Alabama already legit entered that season without either quarterback having a collegiate start, and that's just like this 2026 battle. In fact, the competition was so close that Nick Saban, he went into the season opener against Kent State, and he was ready to play both quarterbacks. McCarron got the start, but Sims did come in early during the first quarter, and Alabama essentially let the competition continue into the season. And eventually, McCarron, he did separate himself, and obviously we remember how that story ended. McCarron, he ended up being Alabama's quarterback, and the Tide went 12-1 and beat LSU and won Nick Saban's second national championship at Alabama. And McCarron, he didn't have to be Superman that year. McCarron's job was to command the offense, protect the football, and make the throws that were there and steadily become more and more comfortable as the season went along. And by the end of it, Alabama had found its future star quarterback. So when Jake asked me about what Alabama quarterback competition this one reminds me of, I would say A.J. McCarron and Phillip Sims would be my answer. 2 talented quarterbacks, neither one had started a college game, and one was the older, more experienced player and had spent time as the primary backup, and the other quarterback was the younger, highly rated quarterback that had a lot of upside. So shout out to listener Jake for another great question. And if you have a topic you want covered as well, leave it in the comments and we'll have it featured in a future episode. So we're getting deeper into Alabama's fall camp, and I think we're getting a much clearer picture of what this offense is going to look like in 2026. And after listening to Ryan Grubb talk about this group, I think there's a few players who could really stand out, but I think we've got to start with Ryan Coleman Williams. Because the more we hear about Coleman Williams during camp, the more it sounds like he's ready to be one of the best receivers in college football. Grubb, he said Coleman Williams is having a great fall camp, and he gave us an example from practice. Alabama's first team offense put together an 80-yard drive, and Coleman Williams, he finished it with what Grubb described as an unbelievable touchdown catch. But the part that caught my attention wasn't necessarily the catch. It was everything that Grubb said about the work behind it. Coleman Williams apparently stayed in Tuscaloosa during his time off in May and worked on the jugs machine and continued to prepare while other guys had opportunities to go home. And Grubb said his preparation had basically been second to none on the rest of the team. And I think that's what you want to hear about your number one receiver, because we already know about the talent. But when your most talented receiver is also becoming one of your hardest workers, that's when you potentially have something really special. And I think whoever wins this quarterback battle is going to be heavily leaning on number one this year. And another player that caught my attention was freshman running back Trayshawn Brown. And with A.K. Deere expected to miss some time, Brown's development, it suddenly becomes more important. And Grubb seems really impressed with him. He praised Brown's vision and ability to anticipate defenders before they get into position. He also mentioned his ability catching the football coming out of the backfield. But here's one thing that did surprise me a little bit. It was his pass protection. Brown, he's not, a huge running back, but Grubb said he's much better in pass protection than people might expect. And that's a big deal for a freshman because talented running backs, they usually, do what they do, and that's run the football. But what keeps freshmen off the field is everything else. Can you protect the quarterback? Can you understand your assignment? And can the coaching staff trust you on third down? Because Brown, he's apparently showing all of those traits already. And considering the injuries that Alabama's already dealing with at running back, don't be surprised if he gets opportunities early this year. Daniel Hill, I still think, is the guy that I expect Alabama to lean on. And Grubb, he called him one of the biggest examples of growth on this entire team and praised his physical transformation and his maturity and his knowledge of the offense. Kevin Riley, he continues to give Alabama another experienced option as well. But Brown, he's making this running back room a lot more interesting. And then there's the tight end position. We've already talked about how much Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb like getting the tight ends involved. And Grubb, he called that entire group one of the absolute bright spots of the camp. And that gets my attention because Alabama has seen different body types and skill sets that it can use in this offense in 2026. And Grubb, he talked about experimenting with whether Alabama wants to use a bigger receiver in certain situations or put somebody like Marshall Pritchett on the field instead. And I think that's where this offense can become very difficult to defend. You can change formations and create mismatches, and you can use bigger bodies in the red zone. And you don't necessarily have to substitute every single time you want to make a change that you're going to do. So I think there's still some questions on this offense. Obviously, we still don't know about Austin Mack or Keelan Russell being the starter at Alabama, although Grubb did say that they're getting closer to making that decision. And there's still some battles that are happening along the offensive line as well. And there's some injuries that Alabama's dealing with at running back. But we're also starting to see some of these pieces come together. Ryan Coleman Williams, it sounds like he's having a monster camp. Trayshawn Brown, he's emerging as a freshman who can continue to play earlier than expected. And Daniel Hill, he's starting to look like that workhorse back. And the tight ends, they're starting to become one of the strengths of the offense as well. We're getting closer and closer to the season, and now the biggest question is whether all of this progress we're hearing about in practice is going to carry over to when Alabama takes the field on Saturdays. One of the biggest questions I had about Alabama's defense heading into this season was at inside linebacker. And now that with the season getting closer, it sounds like Kane Womack is starting to find some answers. Alabama had to replace a lot of experience at this position from last year. Deontay Lawson, Justin Jefferson, and Nakai Hill-Green, they're all gone. And those were Alabama's top three off-ball linebackers last season, so this wasn't a situation where you were simply just replacing one starter. Alabama basically has to rebuild the entire rotation. But after 11 practices of fall camp, Womack says that Alabama's now pretty close to figuring out which 3 or 4 linebackers who will get a majority of the snaps early in the season. And I think the first name we're probably going to be able to write down in ink on this defense is Caleb Woodson. Alabama brought in Woodson from Virginia Tech for a reason. He gives Alabama's defense a lot of experience. He started 16 games during his time as Virginia Tech, and everything we've heard since he arrived in Tuscaloosa suggests he's going to have a major role in the middle of this defense. But the bigger question is going to be what happens next to him. QB Reese, he entered fall camp as one of the favorites that have the other starting job next to Caleb Woodson. He's got some experience from last year, and he was running with the first team defense during the A-Day game. But I don't think you could talk about this competition anymore without bringing up Luke Metz. Metz, he's probably been one of the biggest risers of Alabama's defense during fall camp. We've recently talked about him in our player preview series, and Kane Womack has been very complimentary on the way he's been developing. Womack, he said that Metz was spending too much time thinking too much in the spring, and he was worried about making mistakes instead of just playing football. But once he started trusting in what he was seeing and started playing aggressive again, a lot of things started to change. Now Womack says Metz is back to being able to play at a very high level, and I think Metz is going to get a lot of playing time. Whether he's technically listed as a starter against East Carolina, that really doesn't matter to me, because Womack, he likes to rotate his linebackers. He said his defenses typically settle on 3 or 4 guys, and they handle the majority of the snaps, and then they'll mix in some other players depending on the situation. So if Woodson, Reese, and Metz are 3 of those guys, all 3 are going to get opportunities. And then I think it also gets interesting with other guys. I think Caden Jones is still in this competition, and Abdul Sanders has also got some positive attention during camp. And then you've also got one of the more talented freshmen on the roster in Xavier Griffin. I don't necessarily expect Griffin to, just waltz in and to become an every down linebacker for this team, but with his athletic ability, I would be surprised if Kane Womack doesn't eventually find ways to get him onto the field. And that's what I like about this group. Alabama doesn't necessarily need another Deontay Lawson sitting there with 3 years of starting experience at Alabama. But they have a lot of options. Woodson, he gives you the veteran. Reese, he gives you somebody who's been developing in this system. And Metz, he gives you a physical linebacker who seems to be taking a major step forward. And then you've got the young guys that are behind them that are pushing for opportunities. And Womack, he seems comfortable where things are heading. That's very important because inside linebacker is such a critical position in this defense. These guys have to be able to communicate, they have to be able to fit the run correctly, and they have to be able to cover. And when the defensive line is doing its job, these linebackers are able to come downhill and finish plays. The good news is Alabama's defensive front has been getting a lot of positive attention during camp as well. If that bigger defensive line can keep blockers off these linebackers, it should allow, Woodson and Reese and Metz to be able to just pin their ears back and play fast. And that's when this group can become really interesting. So we're not quite at the point where Kane Womack is publicly giving us his linebacker depth chart, but I think we're getting very close. And right now, I think Caleb Woodson, QB Reese, and Luke Metz are 3 names Alabama fans should expect to see plenty of time when this season starts. The real question is going to be who's going to get that start next to Caleb Woodson. It might be somebody who Alabama simply can't afford to take off of the field just because of their talent and their production during camp. So we're going to continue our player preview series today with a guy who might end up being one of the more important factors on Alabama's defense in 2026, and that's defensive lineman Devin Tompkins. And Tompkins is really interesting because he gives Kane Womack something that Alabama really values up front, and that's versatility. Tompkins, he transferred to Alabama this offseason after spending 4 seasons at USC, and he wasn't necessarily a huge name coming out of high school. He played at Edison High School in California, and he was rated as a 3-star edge prospect in the 2022 recruiting class. 24/7 Sports had him as a number 45 edge in the country and a top 65 player in the state of California. And I think his development since then, it's been very interesting because Tompkins, he originally arrived at USC as more of a long, lean edge player. But now Alabama has him at 6'5" and 300 pounds. So we're talking about a guy who's basically grown into a defensive lineman while maintaining some of that athleticism that originally made him an edge prospect. And that's what I really like about his game. Tompkins isn't just a 300-pound defensive tackle who's going to line up in the same spot every single snap. Alabama's going to be able to move him around. He can play the bandit position on the edge, and he can slide inside and play the 3 technique. And depending on the offensive personnel, Kane Womack can change the look of his defensive front without necessarily having to substitute guys. And I think that's very valuable. And Tompkins, he's already proven that he can produce at the Power 4 level. During his USC career, he totaled 55 tackles, 9 TFLs, and had 4.5 sacks over his 2 most productive seasons. And last year was easily his best. Tompkins, he finished 2025 with 31 tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 2 pass breakups, and a quarterback hurry and a forced fumble. And apparently Alabama liked what they saw because Tompkins was one of the more highly regarded defensive linemen that were available in the transfer portal. Alabama's official roster notes that On3 rated him as the number 2 defensive lineman in the portal, while 24/7 Sports had him 5th among defensive linemen. But here's where Tompkins becomes really important for Alabama in 2026. I think he's got a chance to be a really good starter at Bandit. And more importantly, Kane Womack seems to view him as somebody who can help Alabama become more physical against the run. We've heard about Womack talk about fall camp and wanting his defense to do a better job of attacking blocks and controlling gaps and getting off those blocks as well. But here's the facts here. Tompkins, this guy's 300 pounds. So if Alabama can put him on the edge against a tight end, that's a pretty significant size mismatch. And if an offense brings in bigger personnel and tries to run directly at Alabama, you've got a guy who can set that edge and prevent the running back from cutting it outside. And then on passing downs, you can move him inside and potentially create a mismatch against a guard. And I think that's why he's such a good fit. He's not necessarily going to be a guy at Alabama who gets 10 or 12 sacks. That's, not his game, so to speak. But I think he could be one of those players who just makes everyone around him better. And if Tompkins is controlling the edge, that's going to help the linebackers. If he's occupying blockers inside, that's going to create opportunities for Yonze Pierre and Alabama's other premier pass rushers. So that's the type of impact I'm really excited to see. And at 6'5" and 300 pounds and 4 years of college football behind him, Alabama's not bringing in Tompkins just to sit and develop. He's here to play right now, a plug and play along the defensive line. So keep an eye on this guy on the defensive front. Devin Tompkins, he might have not been the flashy 5-star recruit coming out of high school, but after developing at USC and transforming his body into a 300-pound defensive lineman, he's now got an opportunity to become a major piece of Kane Womack's defense. And if Alabama's defensive front can continue to take that step forward that we're hearing about in fall camp, I think Tompkins is going to be a big reason why. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's show, but I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on today's topics and what storylines do you want covered in a future episode? Let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider giving a thumbs up, subscribing to the channel, and enabling notifications so you're always up to date with our Alabama football coverage throughout the season. And for more Crimson Tide content between videos, including recruiting news and team updates and analysis, be sure to follow me on X and Instagram at ZAitken7. So guys, thanks again for watching Crimson Tide today. And until next time, roll Tide.